You've written a book dedicated to good talking. You've also written one dedicated to good writing. Who are the best communicators alive right now?
Oh, God, that's very hard to say. I mean, the best talkers. I mean, it's a cliche maybe to say, or it's kind of a very obvious answer to say. I still think Barack Obama is extraordinary. Though, as my old friend Philip Collins, speechwriter, said, he's not even the best speech maker in his own family. Um, but I think Obama was what inspired me actually originally to write that book
Nice.
about rhetoric, because I just saw, wow, this was about 2008, and I saw this guy who was using unashamedly and virtuosically all those kind of rhetorical tricks and tips that I had long previously in my undergraduate career kind of taken a shine to. And I was like, wow, here's somebody being intentionally using a rhetorical high style and being really good at it. And what's more, it yielding, this being 2008, some real results for him. And I think he's still extremely good in a weird way. His sort of nemesis and antipole, Donald Trump, has a sort of effectiveness as a communicator, though it's in a very different sort of style. He's a sort of anti-rhetorical style. It isn't, a purposely unpolished style, but one that's nevertheless itself very, very rhetorically effective. As far as good writers, my God, I mean, I do that for a living, and there are too many to count. And I think you always, and this is one of the kind of points I've always tried to make when I'm talking about rhetoric itself, and indeed language in general, in the book I wrote about the written language, which is, you can't really say whether somebody's good in isolation. It's more, for a particular task. You're not you're comparing apples and oranges sometimes, because there are any number. When you say good communicator, I mean, there are lots of people who I think are terrific writers, but who may not be communicating to an end.
That's
in
the
way
distinction
that
I'm looking for. Good communicator, irrespective of how good their prose is.
Exactly.
Can they deliver a message?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what's of good examples of written communicators who are very lucid and clear. I'll probably have to come back to you on that. I mean, there are a number of journalists who are terrific, and I think journalists generally are actually weirdly where you look for, or where you're most likely to find, very good people in the business of direct communication, because that's their absolute bread and butter. They need to get stuff across quickly and make it, if they're comment journalists, they need to make it persuasive and entertaining in a very short space of time. They absolutely can't rely on a captive audience in the way that, the people who are writing, internal policy documents for corporations can, or, dictators can. And obviously literary writers are in a different game. So I think probably, look at probably the New Yorker, places like that, the Spectator, that's where you'll probably find some of the best communicators alive, I think. They're really, they're really good journalistic writers.
Are these journalists you're thinking of directly employing the lessons of rhetoric, or is it rather just through a long period of iteration of trying to communicate a message, they've somehow crafted it? Or is it just a direct, here are the employment of the lessons?
Well, I think it's mostly unconscious. I mean, my argument in the book about rhetoric is that rhetoric is a way of describing something we do. It's a sort of, you can certainly learn it. Aristotle said, it's a techne, it's a thing that you can teach and learn, and you can get better at it. But what you're doing is something, we use language rhetorically from the moment we are able to use language at all. We're always on the make, I mean, and rhetoric really is just language plus power. And we've just discovered there are things that work. We instinctively group things into groups of three, the tricolon. We instinctively, as I've just done there, we instinctively use anaphora, where you use the same set phrase in the beginning of successive sentences. A lot of those sort of stylistic tics of rhetoric are things that, speech writers use them consciously, and there are certainly people who will very consciously, as craftsmen, go in and go, right, we need a tricolon here, we need to, gussy this up. But a lot of the time, I think we have imbibed them so much that they become nearly as natural as breathing. We use those things in the spoken language as well as in the kind of written for speech language. And I think, almost anyone who's a journalist will be familiar with, you're writing a comment piece. Okay, find a way of bringing it, or even a long piece of reportage. You find a way of making your payoff somehow circle back to the opening line, or, tie it up with a bow, and all of those things that become instinctive.
You mentioned the direct swing from rhetoric Obama to then really the opposite, anti-rhetoric Trump. Actually, I should check myself there. Is that even the case? Is that what it was?
Well, I've got it's probably too grand to call it a Hegelian view of the history of US presidents. But I tend to say they find one who's a good speaker and they become disillusioned with him and chuck him out and try and get one who can't string a sentence together. And then they get fed up with him and they go back to a good speaker. Yeah. And I think you could see, to an extent, I mean, it's a kind of jokey point to take, but, George W. Bush was notoriously inarticulate, though that didn't make him rhetorically ineffective, but he wasn't someone who sounded like he was in command of a fabulous high style. He didn't sound like someone who really knew how to use language in a conscious way. And, W ended up coming to grief, as they all do. Obama suddenly looked great. He was clever. He could talk. He knew stuff. Wonderful. All that hopey changey stuff came along. Had Obama. Then obviously everyone came to mistrust Obama, because people do come to mistrust presidents after a couple of years. And, we got Trump, who was, very much the antithesis. But the point I would want to, I mean, you said, and I think you were picking up on something I said kind of flippantly, that there's, Trump is anti-rhetorical. One of my real baseline arguments, as I see it, about rhetoric is that what seems like anti-rhetorical stuff is also rhetorical. I mean, I've got a kind of Derridean view of sort of wall-to-wall rhetoricality, that rhetoric, in my broad understanding of it, is really anywhere that language is involved with power, i.e. persuasion. And which is to say, it's almost all language all the time. Yep. And you can appeal to people by seeming, which is one of the, Aristotle came on this idea of the ethos appeal, how you present yourself to your audience. And one way to present yourself to the audience is as the guy who knows stuff. You're an expert, you're smarter than the audience, you can lead them along, you can, they can trust you because, you're the person who's in command. Another way you can appeal to the audience is to seem like someone who's just honest and completely trustworthy and completely transparent. And, the kind of one locus classicus of this is the great funeral oration off in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Mark Antony says, I am no orator as Brutus is, but as you know me all, a plain, blunt man, which is just, fantastic piece of cheek. Yeah. He's much, much better orator than Brutus is, but he's already put his thumb on the scales by saying, Brutus, he's doing rhetoric. He's fooling you. He's tricking you. He's playing on your emotions using these techniques. Yeah. And I don't use techniques. I speak from the heart. The moment someone tells you they're speaking from the heart, that is the most... It's like people claiming, this isn't political. Right. I mean, in the same way that ideology, suffuses, as Marxist critics will say, all of literature. You can't say this literature isn't political because literature is political depending on what it chooses to omit. A literature that omits politics, as people have complained about, say, Jane Austen. They say, well, it's all, surely it's just all about people having balls and worrying who's going to marry who. And so, well, of course, in order to focus on that, you have to pull focus from the, gigantic slave-funded international society which gives rise to all this wealth in the West Country of England. So that's the argument that Marxists make about ideology in literature, and I think the same argument can be made about rhetoricality, which is when you're trying to persuade somebody, saying you're not using rhetoric is itself a rhetorical sally. And, why George W. Bush, much to the kind of frustrations of the coastal elites, the fact that he said really stupid stuff when he opened his mouth and his sentences didn't really make sense, didn't really harm him with the voters, because there's a sort of sense of, if somebody seems like they barely know what's coming out of their mouth before it does, there's a kind of Forrest Gump quality to that you think, well, okay, he may not be the sharpest tool in the box, but he's honest and he's decent and he's certainly, if he can't put a sentence together himself, he's certainly unlikely to be tricking me. Right. Whereas people who are smooth, people who are completely in command, who have sort of beautiful command of language and rhetoric, like Obama, it can come to count against them because you've got this, that guy's too smooth. That's kind of used car salesman patter. There's a sort of sense that I don't trust this guy because he's flyer than me. and so both of those become rhetorical strategies. And, Trump has that whole I am anti the smooth Washington coastal elites thing. And he's very, very good at mustering, in the great triad of rhetorical appeals, pathos, which is to say emotion. Okay. Trump's speeches are designed to make you feel rage and pity, and he plays on an audience's rage and anger, and and that I think itself is very powerful, and particularly in the social media age where we know that, again, and I guess we'll get onto this, but. It's always old wine in new bottles. Rhetoric and what rhetorical strategies work absolutely adapts itself to its audience, generation by generation. That means it also adapts itself to the means of transmission. And in the digital age, we know that the means of transmission is often social media and virality and so forth. And we know that what goes viral, what works, is emotional rather than, as it were, logical appeals. It's something that's short that makes you feel something fast and respond quickly.
Yeah. The rhetoric of Trump, as you analyze the way he speaks, do you think he's consciously using pathos rhetorically, or rather, do you think it's just unconscious, this is how he communicates, and it happens to be along these lines of traditional rhetoric?
I think it's probably pretty instinctive for him. I mean, I don't want to get into a kind of, always into awful sort of thing, but I think he's obviously a person who has, if you like, quite poor impulse control, and who's quite angry or self-pitying quite a lot of the time. And, cometh the hour, come the man. He's sort of very well suited, as it turns out, to a particular form of media transmission and a particular kind of constituency that he was speaking to at a time when after 2008 a lot of working class Americans felt that smooth Washington elites represented by the likes of Obama had sold them down the river. Everything had gone to shit. Yeah. All the masters of the universe we were supposed to trust to keep the economy buoyant turned out to have been lining their own pockets, and it all went to hell in 2008. I mean, that's a sort of political point, but the sort of background to that is that Trump, admittedly, there is the absurdity of his ethos appeal. He's a supposed billionaire, presenting himself as this kind of perfectly ordinary man of the people. But he's sort of, his ethos appeal is kind of clever because it's simultaneously buys into that kind of compensatory fantasy of, that has long been remarked that the American dream, is really a way of telling people who haven't got much money, we have this wonderful free market in the American dream because everybody has the chance to get lots and lots of money. I mean, the fact that you have a vanishingly small chance if you start out poor in America from getting lots and lots of money. Nevertheless, the American dream becomes this kind of totemic compensatory fantasy for a very unequal society. Yeah. Again, so I'm not meaning to kind of drift massively into politics, though it does tie in with this. Because Trump presents himself as a sort of insider-outsider. He is the guy who's just like you, and at the same time, he's guy who's got lots of money and all these hot chicks.
Lives in a hotel.
And lives in a big golden hotel. Yeah. And everyone goes, yeah, I'd like some of that. Yeah. And he's clever at positioning himself like
and
that.
In that cleverness, is it conscious or just instinctively that's how the man has communicated?
I think he's obviously cunning. I don't know whether I'd call him clever. I don't think he's got much book learning. I don't think he's, probably reads a book from one year to the next. So the idea that he's been kind of scrutinizing Gary Wills's study of Lincoln's oratory and applied it to himself, as undoubtedly Obama did.
Right.
But the other thing that people have, there was a really interesting piece in, I think it was Vox, that got linguists to analyse Trump's speech style. Because, you get kind of rhetoric guys and speechwriters and people like me to go, well, that's a tricolon, and look, he's using an aphory here, and he does do all that stuff. Again, it's sometimes instinctively, sometimes when he's actually reading what his speechwriters have written for him, though he seems to improvise a lot. But the Vox piece had people who said what he's doing is very much what stand-up comics do. His way of delivery, and they said it's very characteristic, kind of New Yorker-y, Queensy kind of thing, is that he doesn't finish sentences. And he very often, he'll say, he'll get halfway through a sentence, and then as the audience sort of responds, he'll go, yeah, you know what I mean, and the audience comes to kind of complete his thoughts for him.
Oh, man.
And that
is
kind
cunning.
of, it is. And I think it is that stand-up thing, where someone will start telling a story about their washing machine. They'll get halfway through and the audience will start to giggle in recognition because everyone's had a washing machine that's gone wrong like that. And he's like, am I right? Am I right, guys? And that kind of am I right, guys thing, if you look at it in rhetorical terms, is a very good way of kind of co-opting. Partly it gets him out of legal trouble because very often he'll say, the audience will say the bit that's the incitement to violence rather than him. But also it co-opts the audience as part of the speech-making process. And that's absolutely central to the way rhetoric's always worked, that, all rhetoric in some sense is identity speech, because it starts out with the speaker saying, this is me. And the speaker very quickly wants to try and make a connection with the audience, and that connection is almost always, I'm one of you. This is us. This is why, endlessly, politicians do that thing, despite the fact that most of them, particularly in the States, are, very rich and very weird and very unlike most of their voters. They'll nevertheless, they'll put on a baseball cap, they'll eat a hot dog, they'll, go hunting with an AK-47 if they're Republican. They'll, in this country, in the UK, if you're, for years, the gotcha question for a politician was, how much is a pint of milk?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you didn't know what cost of a pint of milk was. You don't understand the people. So the progress of a speech is almost always from me plus you and you and you and you and you to we. You're binding the audience together into one, and ultimately you're trying to co-opt them, their reactions. You're riding the tide of their reactions. And good speech makers, they don't talk over the applause. They know when to pause to get a laugh. They start to play the audience, and the audience's response becomes part of the whole performance. And of course, the audience is not only then helping to perform, but it's sort of watching. If you make your audience laugh, because crowds behave like crowds behave, the more people are laughing, the more people are going to laugh next time. And so it gets a kind of momentum. Yeah. And Trump's co-optation of the audience, so that they're all shouting, let her up, sorry, lock her up, or, what's that, let's go Brandon, or any of these other kind of
I haven't seen that one.
Tags.
Yeah.
And they absolutely, they become, they're part of a club. Mm-hmm. They're part of a club. And that's powerful rhetorically, I think.
And it's different case to case, obviously, and they need to go hand in hand. But if you could put a percentage divide, how much of a good speech is its delivery versus how much is its written form, its construction?
Hard to put percentages. I would say probably 70-30.
To delivery.
To delivery, yeah. I think it's all about delivery. In the same, stand-up comedy maybe isn't a bad analogy, which is, George Carlin or, I don't know, Bill Hicks or Eddie Izzard could write you and me a routine, and we would die on our asses with their routine. Right. And, good material helps, and bad material can hobble you. If a speech is laden with cliches, if it's self-contradictory in a very obvious way, if it's just clunks, it'll be harder to deliver. But honestly, it's pure rhythm and music, really. And I mean, this is a point I make actually about even the written language, that so much of what sounds to us or seems to us like good writing is stuff that sounds good. It's just the cadences are right. And that's kind of below the conscious level normally. And people who are good writers often just have an instinctively good ear for cadence. An example I use of this delivery thing and the speech making and sound. I remember a Secretary of State for Scotland in this country some years ago who said he was giving a speech. He was a Tory, and therefore not a very popular Secretary of State for Scotland, because it's Scotland's, generally sort of Labourish and SNP-ish. But he said, "I am Scottish by birth, by choice, and by aspiration." Got a huge round of applause. He's not just Scottish once, he's Scottish twice, he's Scottish 3 times.
He must be very Scottish.
Yeah, he must be very Scottish. He's one of us. And there's a lovely rising tricolon: birth, choice, aspiration, dum, dum, da da dum. Just like the opening chords of Back in Black by AC/DC. It's got that lovely rhythm. But of course, if you're Scottish by birth, you have no choice about being Scottish because you were born that way. And if you're Scottish by choice, you can't therefore be Scottish by birth. And you aspire to be something that you're not, but would like to be. So he was simultaneously saying, I had no choice but to be Scottish, I chose to be Scottish, and I'm not Scottish, but I wish I was. Absolutely nobody paid any attention to this.
So
it was,
true,
nobody laughed out of court. They just applauded him.
Right.
Because the rhythm was right, and people aren't really listening to the words. They're looking at how confidently you're standing. They're looking at whether you seem to be enjoying yourself, or whether you seem nervous. Are you cringing? Is there blue on the stage? What's the, and, the reason confidence tricksters, succeed in their tricks is because they're confident more than because they're tricky. Right. And I think that's, I don't want to kind of, reinforce this age-old association between rhetoric and confidence trickery. But confidence is a lot of delivery. And, you could, George W. Bush is another good example. He gave a speech in which he said, and I think I'll try and remember the quote exactly, but he said, "Hope is where our wings take dream. Families is where our..." Anyway, it was complete fucking gibberish. And yet, the rhythm of it was okay. It contained these emotive words: hope, families, wings, dream. It didn't really matter that there wasn't a logical connection between them, Right. And so the sort of smart-ass people like me who are, writing little instant reactions to political speeches and will say, "Oh, this sentence didn't make much sense," or "Oh, I see these paragraphs contradict each other." That's farting into a hurricane. If the politician delivered it well, it will probably have worked fine.
Which is why routinely in any democracy, we're sort of we're optimizing for charisma more than substance a lot of the time.
I think 100%. And I that doesn't mean to me that we need to, sort of abolish democracy altogether and get a sort of Platonic style, selection of philosopher kings, all of whom will be decided on by Dominic Cummings. That seems to me a bad idea. I take the view that, the Ethosians were on something that democracy, as Churchill put it, is, the worst of all systems of choosing government, except for all the other ones that have been tried. Yeah. But absolutely, the way we've set up democracy in most of the Western world, it does optimize for charisma. There is an idea, at least in the UK, that you get charismatic politicians and you have hopefully very uncharismatic but extremely attention to detail-y civil servants who work on policy, and there's a kind of little yin and yang going on there. We fortunately don't, it's not quite as stupidly constructed as all that. We do have this idea that you need a secretariat as well as an executive, and you need people, you need some counterbalances to the flashy lunatics. But undeniably, the flashy lunatics have the upper hand. And in recent years in the UK, the flashy lunatics have been given the, Solomon sober people of the Secretariat a really good shoeing in public. Yeah. So it's tricky. But we do optimise for charisma.
Emphasising the delivery, I brought up this guy with you before we were recording, Christopher Hitchens. You watch his videos on YouTube, or at least I'll speak personally, watching his videos on YouTube. Absolutely loved it. Thought this is the best speaker I've ever seen. I admire it. I emulate it. I want to recreate it. And then as I've grown older and revisited a lot of these debates he does, you realize that it is actually charisma driving it and not necessarily substance, particularly in some of his religious debates. There's a great video online that looks at the sophistry of Hitchens in a lot of his arguments against God, which isn't to say, he's not on the right side of the argument, in my opinion. But nonetheless, it was pure charisma, pure audience work that drove him through what was actually an empty point.
I think that's true. I think that's a fair criticism of Hitchens. I think he was very clever. I think he does coast a long way on passion and audience work. I think, weirdly, he's had a sort of second round of super celebrity almost posthumously, because he fits very well into that, because he's so aggressive, and rivetingly so, and articulate, definitely, in the sense that he's aggressive, but he's never inarticulately aggressive. The aggression comes through in an absolutely, logically, it may jump from step 1 to step 3, but in terms of the sort of verbal torrent and the apparent precision, he never misses a beat. The sentences are all in place.
Absolutely.
And that means that he is perfectly tooled for this. Again, we're now opening onto a wider question about the way that democracy and the world is affected by the means of transmission and the media we've got. That genre of social media video, which is all like, watch Christopher Hitchens destroy. Yeah. And you get those kind of YouTube videos. It's, Jordan Peterson destroys, owns, hammers. And it's always, 10-second clip.
Yeah. Some college student just gets eviscerated.
Exactly, some college student is eviscerated, and it's got sort of Mortal Kombat finishing move, crudely photoshopped onto it, which some would say is not necessarily the ideal way to go about deciding on whether something's true or not, or the comparative merits of a complex case. But there is a lovely story that I think it's in Amos's memoir, that he introduces someone to. I think maybe Amos introduces his dad to, it's Gillian Barnes and Christopher Hitchens, and Kingsley goes, "Now, are you the one who can talk but can't write, or the one who can write but can't talk?" And I think Gillian can now talk quite well, and I think Christopher Hitchens' writing was never as elegant as Amos's or Barnes's, but he was the talker. Actually, sure. I think, in a way, I reread some of Hitchens' essays not very long ago, and I was kind of not as impressed with them as I was hoping to be.
Okay.
I don't know about logical aporia, but he's just not quite the stylist I think he's claimed to be.
And he might be remembered so just because of how forceful his speaking is.
Yeah, and his persona and his shtick.
His persona, I would say, for someone of my generation, is very typical. Our experience of Hitchens is via YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe written later. And so you can be drawn down a false lane of he's brilliant on every measure possible.
It's very interesting you say that generational thing, because dismayingly to me, you're like 20 years younger than me, and so you're absolutely of the generation that caught his YouTube fame, because he certainly he was very celebrated for most of the last 15 or 20 years of his life. One of the things he did also, which is not to do with spoken or written, he was very good at choosing his enemies. He went, I'm going to pick a good enemy, and he loved to fight.
So, they were worthwhile enemies. Mother Teresa.
Yeah, he went from okay, who does everyone love? Right, Bill Mother Clinton. Teresa, we'll have her. Yeah. And then he went, right, the Elgin Marbles, that'll be worth us 6 months of my time to kick up some shit. And Kissinger, he was on the same side, but then he and when it came to the famous thing that obviously put him on the outs with the left was the Iraq War.
Yeah.
But I don't think that was a cynical career move, actually. I do think he was a believer.
Oh, yeah.
I think that people who go, oh, he's just... he wrote that book, Notes to a Young Contrarian, which I think is a kind of, in a way, selling himself a bit short, because I think his publisher probably said, we want you to do a thing about contrarianism. Because I think he was interested in the idea that if you get too complacent in your position, you should look at it from another one, i.e. be contrarian in the sense of kick the tires of your own prejudices.
Yeah.
But I don't think he was someone who was contrarian in the sense that he simply picked up one end of an argument because everyone else was on the other one.
in Letters to a Young Contrarian, he disowns the title of contrarian.
Well, there you go.
Which in itself is very contrarian.
Exactly. What a dick.
But nonetheless, yeah, I think it would be incorrect to say that he simply chose the other side of that argument because it would be a good career move and it would get a lot of attention.
Yeah. And there were a lot of honourable people on the left who, I mean, they ended up with egg all over their face, but yeah, who did take the view. I mean, again, this kind of slightly ancient history for you, but at the time of the Iraq War, I remember I was commentator at a Telegraph, and there was a small but honourable minority of lefties who instead of simply going, right, we don't like America because they're the big bad, and we're against wars because we're on the left and we think wars are bad. They all said, look, Saddam Hussein is like as big a fascist bastard as you will find on the face of the earth, and if
as bad as they get,
and sure, maybe the case for his connection to 9/11 is a little bit tenuous, but from an entirely Leninist point of view, you go, right, if W wants to stamp on this guy, we're in favour, and all the gays and leftists and women and trades unionists and ordinary people in Iraqi civil society will be very pleased to see the back of him, and why shouldn't we be in favour of it? Now, the answer was, well, didn't work out quite how you'd hoped, did it? But which is to revisit a very old and sterile argument. But I think he took that position from an honourable and basically from the left.
Mm-hmm. Before we return to
we've strayed. But that's the nice thing about podcasts is you can.
Is there anything worth mentioning from your interactions with Hitchens?
I didn't have many interactions with him. I remember meeting him at a succession of parties where he was, always kind of sweating whiskey, and he was always very charming and delightful. I remember a young Nick Lezard, scurrying up to him at a party when I was talking to him and saying, "I'm writing a book about The Simpsons. Do you watch The Simpsons? I'm trying to collect essays, thing on The Simpsons." And Hitch saying, "I think The Simpsons is the only reason to own a television." And I'm kind of peeling across a field in hay, pursued by another old friend of mine who was desperately trying to have a drink with him, and he was like, "No, I'm off." But actually, the abiding in-person memory I have is of seeing him on a stage, which is a good. I think it's a good corrective to the Hitchens was always destroying and working the audience and hammering his opponents. It was him doing a debate, very stagey thing, with his brother Peter Hitchens, who, as you probably know, is
a weird dude.
Having started out as I think as just as much of a trot as Christopher, became intensely conservative. In fact, he proudly calls himself a reactionary. Yeah. But the Hitchens brothers were doing an on-stage debate, and of course the audience was 95%.
And you went to watch it?
I went to watch it.
Oh,
yeah,
brilliant!
Just sat in the audience. The audience was obviously 95% Christopher fanboys. Mm-hmm. I mean, I use boys advisedly, fan people, but let's face it, most of them are boys. Yeah. And Peter Hitchens, the so-called hated Peter Hitchens. I say so-called because he also calls himself the hated Peter Hitchens in capital letters. Passive-aggressive move. And Peter's very articulate, as is Christopher. And it was a really good debate. But the audience started booing and jeering Peter when he started to speak. And Christopher stood up. And I don't think there was not much love lost between the brothers, I understand it. He just stood up and said, "Stop it. You're behaving like children. You're behaving like animals. Let the man speak. This is not how we debate." And I thought, good on him for telling his own fans off. Maybe a contrarian move, but...
Yeah, good on him for it. It's actually not a bad way to talk about rhetoric, analysing the two of them, because in my summation, Peter, although maybe he's articulate and I've admittedly never really read anything he's written, he has no charisma like his brother did. And so from a purely delivery point of view.
Yeah, I think he is actually very fluent and articulate. And he's a very fiercely, I often think some of his logic seems to me to be a little bit cockeyed, but he's very, he's A, therefore B, therefore C. His arguments tend to be quite logical. But he doesn't have, I think he's got a sort of prickliness, which is slightly, anti-charismatic. You like people who seem to be confident. Right. We all respond to people who seem to be confident just intuitively in our collective pits. And I think people who seem to be chippy or angry if they're not angry, like on our team. You know, I mean, if you're angry and you're marshalling the audience's righteous anger, it's great. If you're like, fuck you guys, it's me against everybody, that is a very isolating thing to project. And I think Peter Hitchens, who has sort of adopted, I think quite cheerfully, the idea me contra mundum. You know, everybody's mad. The modern world needs dialing back to 1956. You know, leftists are all, you know, dangerous maniacs. People who smoke weed are, you know, a disaster. You know, the Conservative government of the UK isn't nearly what I'd call right wing. You know, I mean, he sort of basically thinks he's surrounded by, you know, communists and drug fiends and wasters and losers, and that, you know, society is on a high road to doom. You know, he likes being the prophet Jeremiah, but it's not, you know, being Jeremiah isn't a way to. I don't know whether that's the prophet I'm thinking of. Might be.
No, wouldn't know.
Anyway, you know, he likes denouncing the evils of the modern world as if it's him alone on his pillar.
Yep.
And I think he's, you know, he's quite cheerful about that, and he's quite effective. But as I say, it's not generally a way to bring an audience with you.
All right, let's return to the book. You made the observation that Trump is in the perfect age because these short little videos optimize for rage or violence and clicks. Jordan Peterson destroys college student, optimizes perfectly for the media consumption. If you looked at a pie chart of where all the media is being consumed, shorts is maybe more than the written word.
For sure.
You go on the tube, it's like people are TikToking 10 to 1.
And we even know that, I mean, you know, as I repeat, I'm a very old fart and tied into kind of, you know, legacy media in which, you know, you write like 1,000 words in a newspaper, which is, you know, absolutely gone. But, you know, even I understand that if you're using social media, something like, they found that on tweets, if it's got a picture, it travels much further than if it's just text. And people respond so much more now to pictures and videos, and they're all very short because short stuff travels fast. And, you know, like, it does worry me a bit because it does mean that anything that's complicated or that doesn't easily kind of get subtended into a kind of us versus them frame, or where there are complex trade-offs between risk and reward and various people's interests, which is to say most of the important politics worth doing, is just incredibly hard to make cases for in an age when a very quick, very shrill response is what, and you know, ideally a visual one, as what travels.
And this quote from the book, with that idea in mind, I think is quite strong. And I don't know if it's your observation or if it's Socrates, but this is the quote. Socrates was worried the written word would cause the art of memory and thinking to fall into disrepair. People would imagine that just because they've read something, they would know it. So, with that idea, furthermore, isn't the same feeling relevant for the changing medium as we've just discussed in the shorts?
Yeah, I think, in fact, what I've just said is in a way a kind of like gold-plated example of exactly what I also, you know, attempt to treat with some caution, which is that every change in medium or technology is generally greeted with panic and, you know, a sense that...
A fear of loss.
A fear of loss and a sense that everything's going to make us stupider. So, you know, when the theatre came along, you know, the Puritans thought that was a really terrible idea. Novels were a terrible idea. You know, they were going to make young women stupid. And, you know, obviously the television, the goggle box, nobody was ever going to read books anymore. People were just going to become stupid because they watch television all day long. You know, David Foster Wallace watched millions of hours of television as a young man. And, you know, David Foster Wallace was quite clever.
He's so revered among authors.
Yeah.
Was he that good?
I think he was great. I mean, I love him because he was funny. He had a lot of heart and very good jokes. And he was very clever. He was a right show-off, but he was... Hey, check out his essays. They're great.
Yeah. Sorry, but go on.
No. And likewise in our own age, I'm occasionally, as a sort of geeky, nerdy computer game person, going like, everyone says computer games and screens are going to destroy our children's minds, and this is, it goes back to that, essential, Socratic mistrust of the written word because it would destroy memory. Each new technology has people saying it's the end of the world, and generally it's not. Generally, it changes the ecosystem, but it does fit in. So, no doubt, the things that I'm panicking about, nobody thinks joined up anymore. The internet's rewiring all our brains to be stupid, is going to turn out to be. It'll shake out somehow. But I have to say, at the moment, I'm definitely caught in that particular moment of thinking, Christ, is nobody ever going to be able to mount a proper argument anymore because someone will simply wave a Palestinian flag or accuse them of being a TERF and it'll all be over.
Yeah. I mean, can you give any stillman argument? What are the virtues for this changing medium where everything is short-term content?
What are the virtues of a medium?
Like, can you say something positive about it?
Well, I think one of the virtues, which is why, it was interesting to me revising my book, is that social media, when I wrote the first edition of this book, it was kind of 2011-ish, hadn't really taken off. It was just starting its ascent.
Yeah.
And now, of course, it is the central fact in political and public, which is to say rhetorical life. Now, without question, it seems to me, the fact that now the potential to reach a vast audience is available to anyone with an ISDN line is a transformational and basically an extraordinarily good thing. For most of the history of rhetoric, it was formal speech making in certain very limited venues. You didn't have recorded, you couldn't record things, you couldn't transmit things. So it basically, if oratory was going to happen, it was going to happen in the law courts, or it was going to happen in the agora, or in the descendants of those things over the years. And it was going to be, powerful white men of a very small minority, in the West certainly, who had the right to speak and could be expected to be heard. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, that has changed. And more people can speak and can find an audience. And, the very fact that, like, you and I are engaged in a podcast in which neither of us, is, like, super famous. We haven't had to kind of go to, I don't know, the BBC to make it.
Right.
And it can go up online, and if people like it, any number of people can download it and listen to it. Is kind of transformation. That's real. That sort of people power. The spread of rhetoric and the spread of democracy kind of go hand in hand. So the democratization of rhetoric seems to me to be an unqualified good.
Yep.
The fact that the forms in which it's currently transmitted tend to prioritize like shouty lunatics, and but we are having those arguments, aren't we? I mean, it's interesting to me that phase one was this sort of laissez-faire thing when everyone gets on Twitter. We've all got free speech. We all get on the internet or Substack or whatever, and proliferation of these platforms. And over the years, there's been kind of slight pushing back, and we're now seeing it. People are arguing about are we all leaving Twitter because it's full of Nazis? Has Substack got a problem with the content? And the kind of idea that, free speech has itself become a sort of shibboleth or a kind of a very live political term.
What's a shibboleth?
A shibboleth, sorry. It's become... shibboleth was a biblical story where they sorted who were they? The two different tribes. One of them pronounced the S in shibboleth more like S.
Okay.
And so when they were all pretending to be each other as refugees, I think I'm getting this quite wrong, but they were crossing a border.
Okay.
And they discovered that using shibboleth, they'd make them say the word shibboleth, and the ones who pronounced it in whichever was the Midianite way or whatever, they let them through, and the rest of them, they put them to death. Sorry.
But it's a way to say...
It's a way
to test whether you're legit or not.
Well, free speech has become such a kind of political football, really. It's become a term in which, like, for the right, free speech, it's all about free speech.
Right.
So arguments about free speech and censorship, about which are fundamentally, in some ways, arguments of how we control these spaces, whether the idea is you have completely laissez-faire attitude where literally everyone goes on the internet and says what they like, and corporations can lie, and false advertising, and all those sort of abridgments of free speech that we have traditionally had. Various forms of censorship, not all of which are malign. Because we have restrictions on false advertising, on libel, on and we tend to say hate speech in various forms. I mean, some people define hate speech as, if you like, you might say Holocaust denial or racist language. In some territories will be regarded as prohibited speech. In others, it might just be bad taste. But most places, in most jurisdictions around the world, tend to draw the line at incitement to violence. So there are these kind of questions over how we police these spaces. We've got these spaces. We know that things travel in a certain way. We know that the lie is halfway around the world before the truth's got its boots on. And I think we're now sort of starting, in the way that laws and regulations and institutions tend to play catch-up with technology. And they play catch-up through a process of sort of human reaction and conversation, sort of say, this technology's got us over here. Okay, that's not an entirely good place. How do we make it safer and better? And I think we're seeing that happening. I think that what's, as we sort of recognise that, amidst all the kind of cornucopia of goods that the essentially unpoliced and unpoliceable free spaces of the internet have supplied us with, in rhetorical terms, there may be some bad things that have come along as well, which is, the disinformation, the signal to noise ratio, the presence of, bad actors, and, I'm not, not even singling out Nazis, but, we talk about Nazis as a sort of paradigmatic instance of, people whose voices maybe we don't want to hear in the same way, but equally, they're the kind of cancel culture mobs which the right tends to object to. So the way in which we start to kind of shape, and I think mostly shaping not de jure, not through kind of state legislation and kind of heavy-handed stuff, even when that works, but shaping through a kind of common discussion about how we use these spaces, which spaces we choose to inhabit, how people's consumer behaviour can bring pressure to bear on platforms to keep their houses in order. And I think the other thing which I've strayed a little away from your original question, which was about the formal question of this, like, small stuff travelling fast.
Yeah.
I think weirdly, it's not quite as straightforward as just everything's in bits and bobs, because one thing we've discovered, podcasts have become a big thing. Podcasts are all over the internet, and people will listen to 2 or 3 hours of people talking about often quite complicated stuff. And indeed long reads. People will Substack thousands of words of articles.
Isn't that such an interesting paradox?
Well, I think what it is that the way that people are using the internet is quite clever. So these bitty, bitesy sites like Twitter. I'm using Twitter as the paradigm because it's the biggest one and it's the one that I most do it. But TikTok maybe, or Instagram. I don't know how much TikTok links to text, but I do know that for like a tweet, you embed a link to something bigger, and so people are using some of these small bitty things to transmit a kind of
a little hook,
a little link, a little look here to something that often will be very big. And people have, the idea, I think it's a popular idea that our attention spans are all completely shot to pieces by the internet.
Yeah,
I think it's like a massive oversimplification and probably neurologically a bit shonky. I remember when Nicholas Carr wrote his book, The Shallows, which was sort of superficially quite impressive. And it was basically one of the first of those, woo-woo, the internet's making us all stupid because our brains are shrinking books. And he said, the internet is physically changing the structure of your brain.
Nice.
And I think it took one critic to say, well, yeah, except when you learn the piano, it physically changes the structure of your brain. That's what neuroplasticity is. If you interact with anything in the world, It's rewiring your brain, because rewiring the brain is what our interactions with the world does.
Sure.
So
Each additional experience.
Exactly. Every experience, every memory, every habit, every everything every affordance or ability you acquire rewires your brain.
Yeah.
And likewise, Stephen Johnson's lovely book, Everything Bad is Good for You, which came out now many years ago, but in which he said, look, we all think that modern telly is making us stupid, or that computer games are making us stupid, or and he actually went structurally. He said, well, look, television of the 1970s, there was a completely linear plot line. Television in the 80s, you'd have 2 or 3 plot lines at most in a soap opera. If you look at something like The Wire or Breaking Bad or The Sopranos, there's like 5 or 6 different timelines. The cutting's much more frequent. The amount of cognitive work that a viewer is doing is getting greater and greater and greater.
Interesting.
As television develops and becomes more sophisticated grammatically. And he said the same, makes a similar argument about computer games. He says computer games, they actually require you to infer the rules of the game from within it. They telescope larger tasks within, a whole set of tasks will telescope inside each other. So, you find your way into the room, and then you have to find the key to open the box, which allows you to find the other key to open the other box, which allows you to, and that these games actually do they may be a total waste of time, but they cause a lot of cognitive work.
Yeah, it's not destroying you.
It's not destroying your brains. It might be. And he argues that all this stuff actually might account for the Flynn effect, which is the observable, but nobody quite understands, I think, at this stage, why, that over the last 50 years or so, IQs in the West have gone up.
Oh, interesting.
Steadily, but surely. And he says it's just because our media is getting more sophisticated. I mean, I don't know whether that's right or wrong. So I don't think it's as simple as to say that, we're all on social media and that's making us dumb. I think it makes us more connected. It allows the spread of information, not just disinformation. But, people, we seem to have an appetite for binge watching television 10 hours at a time.
Yeah, I think I've always never taken too seriously the idea that like TV's bad for you, or reading a book is the only way you could responsibly consume some type of media. It's a very highbrow way to look at things. Like you say, The Wire. I learned so much about American culture. I learned so much about crime. It gave me sympathy, empathy, and entertained me the entire way.
Yeah.
It's like, it's much better than a book.
Well, also, I think the idea, again, it's just maybe a slight detour, but this anxiety, books, books are my thing. Books are my professional life.
Evidently.
But the idea that the only way to take in text or language is through a book, the only proper way, seems to me to be just kind of Philistine. I can sort of see why in the 60s, 70s, 80s, people were worried about telly, because to younger people, telly is attractive, and it's probably more attractive than the work you put into a book. Though actually, I'm writing a book about children's literature, and I looked into one of the reports they did at the time, and they said, in fact, they discovered that television didn't displace reading from children's lives. But you could sort of see why there was the anxiety. But it struck me that certainly in the, of the millennial generation, like, kids are really, really immersed in text. They might not be reading dead tree books that much,
right.
but the social media age was one that was saturated with text.
True.
Texting and emojis and, text messages. Very, very few millennials and Gen Zs like to pick up a phone. They text, they WhatsApp. And obviously, the sort of boomer anxiety was, but it's full of emojis, and they'll basically be incapable of, writing a proper sentence when they're required to do so for an essay or a job application or whatever. But I don't think that's true either, because I think what we've got is a generation of children who are incredibly, young adults now, even older adults now, who grew up absolutely immersed in text, and in text in the written language, and who were very, very adept at what linguists call code switching. They knew, and have always known, the way that we all instinctively know, you speak to your parents differently than you
Right.
speak to your peer group, than you speak to your teacher, than you speak to the judge. You know, we all are masters of a whole set of different languages and registers. And rhetorical effectiveness is all about matching your language and register to your audience.
Right.
And we're all very good at that. And I would be very surprised, and I'm sure we'd have heard about it by now, if the generation that grew up texting each other, you know, the moment they entered the workplace, covered their CVs in smiley faces and emojis and, you know, abbreviated U to the letter U.
Totally.
You know, I think it's bollocks. I think if they're taught, you know, proper reading, writing, arithmetic at school, I think they will know how and when to use it as adults.
Yeah. That's actually a really optimistic look of things, which I haven't heard elsewhere or consumed that opinion.
Yeah, well,
But-
it's kind of optimistic.
But it all completely makes sense as you say it. I think it's easier to have a knee-jerk reaction that
yeah, I mean,
everyone's always all bad.
yeah, it's not about. I mean, I'm not totally complacent about it because I think it is the case that.
And you got 2 young children, so you
Yeah, I've got
very
3 young
firsthand.
children.
Oh, sorry.
And yeah, you met 2 of them. You've been spared the third so far. I had, you know, I'm sort of very aware that the interactivity of, you know, our little pocket friends and the way that they are so ruthlessly optimized for, you know, dopamine feedback loops and, you know, as someone says, they're a slot machine in a pocket. I think we can't ignore that actually elements of the stickiness. I mean, I think, you know, I know a bit about addiction, and I think there is definitely an addictive quality to them that is probably greater than, say, sitting in front of the telly was.
Right.
So I, you know, having airily dismissed the last moral panic, I don't completely dismiss this one. I do think there are issues with phone use, and, you know, I think it's probably not a great idea to let your kids, you know, just be on the phone 12 hours a day.
Right.
But I don't think that everything that they do, you know, I don't think just because you're consuming text on a screen,
Right. That's the point.
doesn't mean you're engaging with language. If you're consuming no text on the screen whatsoever and you're literally playing Candy Crush 12 hours a day, that's, you know, it's maybe another thing.
When you initially wrote the book and also revised for the updated edition, did you come across Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death?
Oh, I know of it. I don't think I've read it.
Okay, I would highly recommend it. It kind of does fly in the face of everything you just said, but this was written in 1987, and it's incredible how prophetic it was, because he was just writing about how TV sort of rots political discourse and rots people's ability to make an argument. And you'd love it, particularly so for the forward or the epilogue, whatever, the opening to the book. It is so good. He basically says, we were all worried about 1984, when in fact it was A Brave New World that sort of won out in the end, where you will be happy by just zoning out to whatever the crap is in front of you. Anyway, but it's, I think 1987 when it was written, and it's phenomenal. And I think an updated version of that now would be a phenomenal bestseller.
Oh, that's very interesting. I mean, I funnily enough, you know, we mentioned David Foster Wallace. That's sort of the joke of his great novel Infinite Jest, which everyone thinks of as an internet novel. It was a pre-internet novel. It was a television era novel. In which there is this thing called The Entertainment, which is a film so ridiculously entertaining it kills you, because people start watching this videotape and they are transfixed by it. And the moment they stop, they just have to go back and watch it all over again. And of course, they forget to eat and they just, you know, die in a puddle of their own shit. And, you know, that's, as you say, you know, he had no idea what was coming down the pipe, you know.
Right.
So I think that the stickiness of entertainment. I mean, in a way, you could read the Amusing Ourselves to Death thing as a reason for optimism, because, okay, if we were having the same panic about TV, you know,
Totally.
maybe
what Aristotle said.
Yeah, it's back to all the
when the written word came about.
Exactly, but it's back to the idea that you know, everything's always making us stupid, but it's always making us. It's often making us clever in different ways that we might find.
Was it also Aristotle who was complaining about his grandchildren and how their generation doesn't respect their elders, doesn't clean up after themselves. all
Oh,
this
I
sort of
don't
stuff.
remember that. But again, yeah.
It was one of the ancient Greeks basically said that, which is
Oh.
hilarious because...
Of course. Well, of course, they didn't know they were the ancient Greeks.
Right.
That's the thing that always does my head in thinking about Aristotle. At the time, he didn't think, here I am at the beginning of Western philosophy. He was just like, look at all this stuff. God, there's people around for ages, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's very hard to avoid falling into that idea that these people, they kind of knew that they were doing something completely different and new. You know, I mean, to us, they're like, oh, he was Aristotle, but he didn't know he was Aristotle when he was Aristotle. He was just a guy kind of wandering around being interested in stuff. Yeah. And I did, in the book that I followed up the rhetoric book with, which was more kind of a style guide, how, you know, tips for how you might use persuasion in, you know, basic English prose. I did have at the beginning a kind of list of all the people who complained the language is going to hell in a handcart. And like the first one in modern times is Caxton. You know, sort of 15th century, you know, English is utterly degraded and will soon, you know, we'll be baaing like sheep and grunting like pigs and it's all. And every single generation says, you know, English. And I think part of that, you know, we were talking about nostalgia earlier. Part of that is just, you know, I don't like new stuff. You know, language changes. We like the way we were taught in school. We like to feel superior to people. So if somebody's saying, you know, less when they mean fewer, there are people of a certain generation and cast of mind who will go, oh, you know, that's just wrong. And, you know, young people today can't speak the Queen's English. But at the same time, you know, this person would struggle to get on with text speak or all of the other variants of language, which are fantastically useful to the young generation. You know, standard written English and formal English, you know, it does change also. It just changes a bit more slowly.
Do you find that... Actually, I forget that question. Let's return to definitional work almost. Yeah. You've mentioned ethos, you've mentioned pathos. Could you just give us the rundown? What is ethos, pathos, logos, and why it's really the building blocks of speeches?
Okay, absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I should probably have set out this stall much, much earlier. But this goes back to Aristotle, who, we're not complaining about his grandkids, formulated the original sort of... I mean, he's the first person who formally thought, how does persuasion work? And he said basically there were three ways... Three appeals, three ways you persuade someone, and they always mingle in almost any piece of rhetoric at all. But they are analytically distinct. An ethos is the way that the speaker presents him or herself to the audience. It's the sort of what your bona fide is. Do you know what you're talking about? You know, do you project expertise and confidence? And above all, I mean, what's really important with ethos is not just it's the extent to which your interests coincide with those of your audience. I mean, which is why the basic ethos appeal, particularly in politics, is, you know, he or she are one of us.
Right.
I was but born fundamentally,
a Scot. I choose to be a Scot.
Yeah,
I aspire to be a Scot.
Exactly. You're talking to your tribe, and you know what you don't want. You know, if you're an audience listening to someone trying to persuade you to take a course of action or not take a course of action, you want to be fairly confident that whatever the benefits of the course of action to you, they're going to be the same as the benefits to the speaker. You know, you don't want the person who wants to sell you this car because, you know, it gets the car off their hands, but you're going to crash the car because the car doesn't work. You know, it's like we've got the same, to take a Taleb notion, the same skin in the game. You want to feel that the speaker isn't pursuing a hidden agenda. So ethos is all about reassuring your audience you have their good on your you know, their interests close to your heart, that you know what the hell you're talking about, and that you're trustworthy. And pathos is the appeal to emotion. I mean, we use pathos now very often to mean, you know, the sad bit in films, but actually pathos is any sort of emotion. Right. And positive emotions, you know, hope, excited anticipation, you know, exultation and triumph. All of these are very powerful emotions, but equally the negative emotions work very well. You know, if you make your audience scared of the consequences of not doing what you want them to do, or you make them angry, or you arouse pity in them, or laughter. And laughter, I think, is a hugely underrated pathos appeal, because in the first case, anybody who laughs implies confidence. If you laugh at your opponent in debate, you've always got one over on them, whereas if you go white and clench your fists and look like they've got to you, you're rattled. And if you laugh or can persuade an audience to laugh, laughter is kind of involuntary. You can't laugh deliberately.
True. Yeah.
And so laughter...
Or if you do, we can sense you're not.
Exactly. And so laughter, as I think of it, is involuntary assent. If you laugh with the speaker, instantly that ethos work of, we're all as one is done. And that's why I think you see on a kind of paradigmatic level, come back to stand-up comedy, the dynamics of a stand-up comic facing a heckler are absolutely about ethos.
Right.
If a heckler gets a bigger laugh than the comedian's stone dead, because the audience is with the heckler, not with him. And that's why they get so bloody good at putting down hecklers.
Yeah. True.
And because also...
Stakes are highest.
And also everybody... one of the things I've said rhetoric is identity speech. Identity is, every identity theorist in the history of the world will tell you, is all about, not so much who you are as who you're not. Define yourself against another. The classic rhetorical sally is find a common enemy. And, in lots and lots of speeches through history, and lots of most consequential speeches through history, finding a common enemy is, let's go and bash those bastards. The Persians are coming, whatever it is. But in a comedy theatre, it's the heckler who's the enemy. Them.
Give us a classic example of pathos.
Pathos.
Pathos is emotion, right?
Pathos is emotion.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a classic example where you'd find one in the... Well, there's Obama's speech at the mass shooting. Do you remember where he started to sing Amazing Grace? He was giving a speech after a school shooting.
And he started singing.
And he started singing Amazing Grace in this oration right in the middle. And that's a sort of almost a cheat pathos, because the moment, song conveys an emotional current that's...
To sing unexpectedly.
Yeah. Partly, having the brass bollocks to do that is, very high risk strategy, but also...
Did it work for him?
Yeah, it did work for him. But but song obviously is... not everyone breaks up with song with pathos, but when Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is drenched with pathos. He's talking... it's got those elevated... that language about, I'm now going to remember, 77, however many years it was. But he says, we cannot consecrate, we cannot... sorry, I'm going to have to maybe I should just...
It's right there, actually.
Pathos is not, as I say, it's very often conveyed, not, because you don't say, I am cross, or I am sad. You might do, but that's not often what carries it across to the audience. So it's not, you wouldn't say this quote is pathos very much. Right. It's more to do with sort of bearing of a speech, the type of language you'll use, the type of connection you'll make with your audience. But
the delivery.
A lot of that's to do with delivery. But I'll just find the Gettysburg Address in here. Oh yes, so in the Gettysburg Address, it's Lincoln obviously consecrating a war cemetery. And he says in it, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And that, it's absolutely kind of, partly it's ethos, is bringing the audience together and saying, but it's turning the art of mourning to political purpose. And it's saying in this humble way, what can we do in the face of the sacrifice that these people have made? And that's undoubtedly, I think, a pathos appeal. That sacrifice is not an abstract sacrifice. It's one that the audience is meant to feel as an emotional loss. But almost whenever a speaker is trying to bring an audience to some sort of emotional pitch, that's going to be pathos. I mean, I think I should remember in the book I do use examples of very cheap pathos appeals, like the way that a charity will never, in its leaflets, send a sort of detailed breakdown of the effectiveness of its spending dollar by dollar. What it'll do is it'll give you a picture of a child, starving, or in fact, it connects puts a human face on something. And we do respond to pathos more than anything else. Logos is the one that comes in third position. And what's interesting about logos, I mean, because it shares a root with logic, and you'd think that means it's all about the logic of an argument. It is about the structure of argument, but it was Aristotle way back when who noticed that logos and logic are slightly different things. And his argument was that logic proceeds by kind of mathematical, by iron chains of inference. So you go, as Plato would have, we're looking at syllogisms. You get your premise A, your premise B, and you draw a conclusion C. So, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Right. And those things are absolutely, a syllogism, there's no wriggle room in it. Mm. And Aristotle said, no, it doesn't work like that in rhetoric, because you're trying to persuade people. And if you're trying to persuade people something about the future, right, in deliberative oratory, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. You could say you're fairly sure that if you, march into the next town carrying your axes, you'll carry the day and win the castle. But it might not go that way for you. Mm. And if you're arguing about the past in a court of law, again, the phrase we use now is beyond reasonable doubt, because the past is in its way as unknowable as the future. Mm. And so he said the way we persuade people isn't with absolute logic. It's with not syllogisms, but enthymemes. And enthymeme is basically kind of half-assed syllogism. It's either a syllogism with a kind of hidden premise, or a syllogism that relies on probability rather than certainty. So logos basically is logic with a whole lot of wriggle room. And that's why rhetorical logic is bendy logic.
Right. So to surmise, ethos, pathos, logos, how can we think about trying to identify that next time we're listening to not only a politician speak, but, maybe just someone who's trying to convince us of something?
Well, you can notice that generally the ethos appeal will be that, because rhetoric gives you a whole set of, analytical tools for the structure of a speech, the structure of sentences and words within it and so forth. But generally, that ethos tends to come near the beginning. Mm. That's the speech, like when a speaker introduces themselves, and that, you think, what's...
Your credentials.
So you say, first of all, what story is this speaker trying to tell me about him or herself? By the way they dress, by the way they comport themselves, and what are they, how are they describing themselves? How are they presenting themselves? And very often, particularly in political speeches, a speaker will tell a story. Mm. They'll, God, I'm weary of the, American presidential candidates, speeches, which always have some personal thing about how their own story is essentially the story of the United States itself. They're always like, my mommy and daddy worked hard, and if they're immigrants, they are the immigrant, or they had immigrant parents, they are the American dream that way. They almost never say, I was born to parents who were fantastically rich, and I went straight to Harvard, and I've never had to do everything. I mean, George W. Bush, he was a hereditary president. Right. His whole thing, and he had a kind of quite charming thing. He always wear a Texan hat, and he was actually born in Connecticut. But he always said, it was just an accident of birth. I was really a Texan, but my mother just happened to give birth to me in Connecticut. But really, spiritually, I'm from Texas. So how you can just see what they're doing in lots of ways, not all of which will be actually directly verbal, to give you a picture of themselves and what they try and occlude and what they try and push forward. Logos, you're looking at how does the chain of propositions in their speech, and the best way of checking that one is, if you can be bothered and you really care, download a copy of the speech's text and just read it a bit carefully, because then you'll be able to notice, where the figures don't seem to add up, or where there's a leap of logic, or where one paragraph seems to contradict another, because in the course of listening to it, it all washes over you, and it'll be sound effects, and you won't be able to see its structure. So, getting at the logos is harder work normally, because quite often the logos is occluded.
So it's credentials, and then this is what I want to do, why it makes sense I want to do this, and then...
And generally, the pathos is very often what comes in the peroration at the end. It's not always the case. Sometimes people start out with screaming pathos. Sometimes, very often if it's a very emotional event, there will be again, it depends what sort of speech you're giving. But typically, you want to leave the audience with a feeling, because they'll remember a feeling much better than they'll remember a fact.
Yeah.
And that's why very often you'll see a speech might be quite logical and careful in the middle. It might say, look, there are 3 reasons we need to do this, and these are the reasons why, and my opponent's going to say this, but I need to rebut that in advance. That's where the logos comes in quite often. In the body of the speech, you advance an argument. I mean, not all speeches advance an argument, but in most deliberative speeches, the sort of speeches I guess we're talking about, an argument at some level is advanced. Yeah, most consequential speeches advance some sort of an argument. And they will pretty it up to make it memorable and to make it persuasive and to make it feel like it's coherent. I mean, those tricks like anaphora and epistrophe, where you're repeating things, or tricolons, where you're clumping things into groups of 3, all of those rhetorical tricks have the effect of making something feel solid. As in the example I mentioned earlier, you can bundle things that actually have no logical connection together at all into a speech, and make them sound like they're, an iron chain, simply by the patterning of words. You put it in a tricolon, or you have a whole series of things introduced by anaphora. I believe X, I believe Y, I believe Z, I believe, and those things suddenly feel achieved and solid and structurally coherent. But they may not be, logically speaking. And there's your fuzzy logic. So you'll get the logical bit in the middle. And then generally, the peroration of most speeches is where you try and just leave the audience with a tune that they can whistle. And so you think, and often it'll be, it'll be the bit which you end up punching the air going, USA, 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 USA. Or... that's why
it's coming home.
It's coming home. It's the good vibe, or the or it might be a bad vibe. It might be
lock her up.
If we do, it might be lock her up, or it might even be a sort of Churchillian moment where it's sort of, unless we act now, one by one, the lights across the European continent are going to wink out, and the Earth will enter an unfathomable phase of darkness from which it may never ever recover.
Is that direct quote?
No, that's a kind of mishmash of various Churchill quotes. But I mean, he did
that's
say
a stirring line.
He did say the lights are going out all over Europe, and he had another lovely line about mournful, broken, mournful. Something mournful about silent, mournful, abandoned, broken Czechoslovakia retreats into the darkness.
Silent, mournful.
That's amazing. And so, sometimes it'll be like, we really have to send up Bruce Willis to stop the meteorite, or we're fucked. And you'll be wanting to emphasise the fuckedness rather than the success of the meteorite in your peroration, because you're trying to scare people into action.
Right.
So it's not always a happy or triumphant or excited thought, but the peroration tends to be where you put down the mood music, and often it's where you use your most flowery phrases, and the high style comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm swearing a lot. I hope that's not...
Oh, absolutely fine.
No, right, good.
Matthew Dix. Are you familiar with him?
I don't think so, sorry. Matthew Dix. So I'm just constantly losing my vape and
No, you're right.
wriggling around for it. Matthew Dix?
Yes. He wrote a book called Storyworthy. He won the Moth storytelling competition many times. And he was actually, like we were saying before when playing ping pong, like he was a surprise, out of nowhere, standout guest. There is a very, very devoted fans of him. He's a school teacher in America, but he is this phenomenal storyteller. Anyway, Not one word of ethos, pathos, logos, or traditional rhetoric speech in his book. But then speaking to him about it and thinking about it now, although storytelling is a big part of good speeches, a story on its own right doesn't necessarily require the other elements of a good speech, because you're not necessarily trying to draw someone in a certain direction. You're just trying to captivate them and entertain them for a short amount of time. It's just an observation.
No,
that
I think
to me.
I mean, stories are very powerful in rhetoric, certainly. I think partly that's because we think, and here you head off into deep waters of kind of, speculative cognitive psychology, but we do think in patterns, as Aristotle kind of recognizes, and we have sort of set forms of argument and ideas, and we have, as any number of structural narratologists have observed, kind of set patterns to stories. And people who improvise stories or storytellers, they will, there'll be a hero's journey, or there'll be, there are ways of holding a story together whereby you reintroduce certain elements, just like the way jokes are structured. And so these kind of archetypal shapes, we're kind of like pre-programmed to respond to them and to receive them. And so sort of archetypal shapes of argument and archetypal forms of story are engaging. I mean, your purpose in telling a story is when you're just telling a story as a storyteller, is not necessarily to what rhetoric has, which is often a call to action. But it does depend to some extent on identification. You want an audience to invest in it and to go along with you and to give a shit about the characters. And in rhetoric, exactly the same thing's going on. You want an audience to invest in the character. The character might be you. The character might be the person you're trying to get thrown in jail, whatever it is. But yeah, heroes, villains, all those things work very well in storytelling, as in rhetoric. I think there's a huge amount of overlap.
I loved that line from the Churchill speech you just drew up. Do you have a short list of favorite lines from speeches ready to go?
Oh God, top of my head, no. I love and often quote the one I quoted earlier from Julius Caesar, the "I am no orator as Brutus is, but as you know me, all a plain blunt man," because it's so outrageous.
Plain blunt man.
I think there are some of those bits in. There are some of the lesser known parts of "I Have a Dream," the Martin Luther King speech, which I think are terrific. When he, for instance, he has a whole thing about the molehills and mountains. There are bits when he's obviously actually being funny, which you think of that as a very solemn speech, but there are sort of jokes. Where he was very improvisational. He used a bit. He had a bit about the dream. And he was originally delivering a speech called Council Check, and I think, at least folk memories and folk singer Mahalia Jackson said, "Come on, tell him, do the dream bit." And so he went, "All right." I mean, he was very improvisational, because he was a pulpit. He would just stand in a folk pulpit and
pure charisma.
Yeah, pure charisma, but also a very, very serious kind of no shit improvisational skill. In I Have a Dream, he has a whole bit that's a kind of riff on Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, where he says, "The hill and mountain made low." And there's a sort of Blakean thing of the mountain of despair. And he establishes these kind of, in the speech archetype. And then he has this anaphron, "Let freedom ring." And he says, "Let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, the curvaceous slopes of California, Stone Mountain of Georgia, Lookout Mountain of Tennessee, and every hill and molehill of Mississippi." And I think molehill there is kind of brilliant, because it can't not be a funny word.
Right.
In this context, he's these biblical rhetoric, he's all these mountains, and he's enjoying himself with ever more kind of baroque descriptions of these various mountains all over the country. And then he's every hill and molehill. I don't know. Maybe Mississippi's much flatter than these other states, but it just seems to me that has not only the effect of being funny, or at least having the confidence to treat something which is of the utmost importance in this speech, I mean, this is a speech about something that is fundamental to the lives and dignity of millions and millions of black Americans, and, for whom many, including Martin Luther King, have themselves suffered and been jailed and been squirted with water hoses and attacked with dogs and all sorts of, really, really horrible shit has gone on. And what's amazing about that speech is that it is uplifting and it's optimistic and it has the confidence to even laugh at some of its own oratory. He's having fun in a weird way. He's really having fun there. I think what was effective about that speech was that it gave hope because it was so sort of, confident.
Right.
It was "we shall overcome." He believed he had the arc of providence on his side, which helps.
And in the book, there is some of the great Churchill lines.
Yeah, there's lots of good Churchill in there. Well, there is a line that we should fight them on the beaches. That very famous bit: fight them on the beaches, fight them on the landing places, so forth. I think the story goes that the radio just cut off briefly before his next line, which doesn't go down into history, is "We'll throw broken bottles at the bastards if we have to."
Really?
Yeah. And there's the Churchill thing that I always think, which is a famous Churchill line, which is indicative of the extent to which, like, rhetoric is made by the audience, and it's what you hear, so not so much as what they say. His most famous line about blood, sweat, and tears. He never said blood, sweat, and tears. He said blood, sweat, toil, and tears. Oh. But it was basically smoothed by memory into a better phrase, because blood, sweat, and tears is metaphorically coherent. Because
it's a cliche now.
Yeah, it is. But A, it's a tricolon. It's a group of three. We somehow, for reasons that I have never got to the bottom of, I did even write to a couple of neuroscientists when it was coming out saying, do we know why we grouping things in groups of three?
Or it's just survivorship bias?
Yeah.
That's the way we've always heard it, therefore that's what we respond
well,
to.
maybe. But certainly triads seem to be the thing. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so it's a group of three, and it's, toil is the only one that isn't a bodily fluid. So, we basically, the grand, march of historical amnesia has just pebble-like kind of smoothed that into a better phrase.
Nice. We are running up on time. You've been very generous, giving me so much time.
Not at all. Well, thank you for...
Oh, no, I'm not wrapping it up yet.
Oh, good.
Can you do maybe 3 or 4 quick more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, absolutely. Were there any speeches in doing your research that you know of which were extremely significant and had huge potential, but were butchered in their delivery and therefore the significance of them lost?
Oh, God. Off the top of my head. I'm sorry, it's such a long time since I've done this. I can't immediately think of a great... I mean, I think there's a survivorship issue in that one as well, which is we don't generally remember the great speeches that were badly delivered. There are good... there are dodgily written speeches that are well delivered. I mean, the Philip Collins, who I mentioned earlier, always liked to point out, and I have to give him credit where it's due for the observation. He said that the famous line in in Kennedy's first inaugural, where he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." So it's an absolutely brilliant line. But the whole of that speech, up until that point, had been about foreign policy. And obviously, there's absolutely nothing that you can do for your country. He said a complete logical disconnect. It worked beautifully because it sounded great, and it, draws the audience in. It says, we're all in this together. But, honestly, it didn't have any logical connection to the rest of the speech, which is all about the Cold War.
You're a podcast host. Do you ever consciously think about any tips of rhetoric that could help you when either interviewing a person or just communicating to people through a microphone?
I wish I was more conscious of that. I think I instinctively find myself using an aphora a lot, because when you can't think of what to say next, you often think, well, start the sentence, whatever you said previously. I mean, it's more that I catch myself in tics rather than anything else. No, my podcast tends to be a sort of rambling conversation. I'm generally focusing, in as much as I've got a plan, on the content of the book under discussion. And also the sort of podcast I host is one where I'm essentially trying to get authors to talk rather than talk myself. So I'm generally just asking, I'm not trying to show off on my podcast.
Book Club by The Spectator.
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah. It's really good.
Thank you.
Really good. I was listening on the way over to, I actually don't know the guy's name, but he'd written a book about speeches, great speeches. I listened to one.
That might have been Philip Collins, or either Phil Collins. I wrote one of. I spoke to him about great speeches.
Speeches that shape the world.
I think that's Phil's book. I also spoke to a guy called Joe Heinrichs, who did a book called How to Argue with Your Cat. He's another of my colleagues in the groves of rhetoric.
Then perhaps some advice for me. How can I use the lessons of good rhetoric to better convince my audience to share with people, to leave reviews, etc.?
Well, I think you do very well in coming across as trustworthy and likable, which obviously is number one. I think, how do you persuade your audience to leave likes and reviews? Unfortunately, if I had an instant answer to that, I'd have more listeners to my podcast than I do. I guess actually the only rhetorical thing that I have noticed that has helped me on my podcast, which I suppose is a sort of ethos thing, is I make a point of always reading my guests' books. And because a lot of those guests are used to being interviewed by, radio hosts who are very harried and haven't bothered to read their books or have had it briefed for them, it's amazing how much an interviewee will open up and feel appreciated and loved if you have clearly, read the book and are asking questions. You say, on page 395, you say this. And they're instantly like, oh, they've actually,
interesting.
Because it means, I think that works in an ethos appeal in the same way in ways, you're in a small town and you're a presidential candidate and you're in a tiny town and you compliment their local baseball team because they're all like, oh, he's found out about our baseball. He likes our baseball. Oh, he likes our town. He takes an interest in us. Yeah. And so I think that an ethos appeal to that extent can be a personal connection between two people just as much as it might be between one person and audience. We're accustomed to thinking of rhetoric as a big thing to a large audience. But actually that's just the sort of tradition of formal speech making. Rhetoric is, as I hope I argue in the book, and I hope I've at least hinted here, is present everywhere there is persuasion, and there's a lot of persuasion is one-on-one. There's probably a whole other book to be written on the rhetoric of getting someone to come on a Tinder date with you.
True. Absolutely. So you're so brazen as to say, when you do sit across from someone, like, on page 234, you had this magnificent quote as like a wink to them, or surely because your job is a literary critic and editor, they sort of know Sam's got an extremely erudite understanding, not only of my book, but the books that surrounds it.
No, I think people are always pleasantly surprised if a radio interviewer has read the book. I mean, I won't generally be quite as unsubtle as saying, oh, this is magnificent. I mean, I think it's generally polite to say if you've enjoyed the book, and if you haven't, to say you've found it interesting.
Right.
But I don't generally consciously use a page reference or something, but it's not like I think, okay, in the first 5 minutes of this, I'm going to quote them directly back at themselves just to prove I've read it.
But
it's
you
more
are
just
thinking in the beginning, I want to somehow signal to him that I've read it.
Not really. I'm describing results really rather than a deliberate project.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I bother to read the books is because I don't think the conversation is generally nearly as worth having if you haven't.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But an accidental byproduct of that is that the
you're doing DJ radio.
I've just noticed that it really helps in terms of opening up, and that's a sort of pleasant side effect of bothering to do your homework properly.
Do you think that, rather than let me ask you, I'll just say my opinion. I think the podcasting is terrific in terms of adding legitimate, in terms of raising the standards for radio, right? Because where else would you actually get such intimate interviews with authors from a host who actually is interested in them? And the reason you know he's interested in them is because he's the curator of the entire show. He's not a host of a show that other people are curating for him.
No, I think that's absolutely, and that's a change. I mean, I think it's changed the grammar of radio a bit in two ways. One of them is absolutely, as you say, that particularly those ones which, like yours and like mine, are kind of basically one-man bands. You know, you're getting one person's sensibility and interests. I mean, in my case, it's not purely my sensibility, it's which new books am I thinking our readers are going to be interested in or whatever. But you got one person. But the other one is because, and it's follows up what we were saying about the internet not being entirely composed of tiny things. You know, almost no like broadcast radio show.
Right, that's true.
Has more than 5 or 10 minutes for an author interview. Absolute tops. I mean, it's, Kazuo Ishiguro, after he's won his Nobel Prize, might get a half-hour special if he's bloody lucky.
True. With 3 ad breaks.
But on, podcasting allows you to go on for hours and hours and hours, which, I mean, it has disadvantages because some podcasts go on for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah.
And it's also invented a sort of kind of hybrid between a traditional radio and those kind of drive time, old-fashioned radio shows where you just had a couple of slightly wacky guys like burbling on at each other and playing records for 4 hours, on a Thursday afternoon. But it does allow that thing which people obviously really dig of quite often podcasts that are just a couple of people or 3 people who you get to just listen to them shooting the shit, and they'll maybe have a vague subject that they like to talk about, politics or history or whatever, or sport.
That's the entirety of the whole sports genre.
Yeah, you just get these guys chatting.
You're there because of cricket, but you might go 2 hours without mentioning cricket.
Yeah, so it's much less structured, and I'm kind of in some ways a bit surprised because I find I get bored just having my own conversation for 2 hours. I don't want to listen to somebody else just talking shit for 2 hours.
Yeah.
But people do, and I think it's because there's an ethos thing there, because you feel there's a sort of quality of intimacy to it. You get to feel that these people are friends, and if you listen to my old friends Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook doing the Rest is History podcast,
great one.
Hugely successful, and it's because they are 2 incredibly knowledgeable guys. I mean, my God, if I had the recall for facts and dates and themes that either Tom or Dom have, I would, retire happy. Yeah, they both know everything, and if they don't know it, they can read a book and they remember it instantly. For me, I'm like, I read a book and I know all about that book for about 3 or 4 days tops, and then it's gone. Even my own books. But you've got like these 2 very erudite and amusing and slightly weird guys just chatting to each other about history, and you learn something, and you're kind of invited into the Tom and Dom living room, and I think that's kind of classic sort of podcast format that works.
Yeah, that is an amazing one. Okay. If you could go back and be present at one speech in history.
Oh, one speech, yeah. That's a good one. I think I'm afraid I'm not going to go very far off the beaten track here, because, the oldies, the goodies. It wouldn't be the Gettysburg Address, because by all accounts, almost nobody who was there could even hear him. And it only went on for 2.5 minutes. So I think it'd be a bit of a letdown to stand at the back and just... It would be like that Monty Python sketch where they're like, bless the cheesemakers.
Yes.
So I think the Gettysburg Address would be deeply underwhelming. I think being somewhere near the front for I Have a Dream would be pretty cool. And actually, I wouldn't half mind having been in Grant Park for Obama's victory speech.
Okay.
Because that
it was a good one.
Oh, it was amazing. Go look it up. And I mean, it was slightly kind of chilling because he delivered it in Grant Park, Chicago, between 2 enormous. They were like the goals for American football fields. Those big kind of Y-shaped things, and they were bulletproof glass. Because at this stage they were like, first black president. Some lunatics going to have a pop at him with a high velocity rifle, aren't they? So it was kind of had that slight frisson of it. but it was tremendously moving. And he tells a story. He tells the story of Anne Nixon Cooper, I think she was called, who was a black woman who had, I think, been born. I don't think she would have been old enough to have been born into slavery, but had first generation after slavery, and had been through all of the civil rights stuff in the South, and had lived through. She was 92 or something, and had lived through all of America's terrible racial history, and
Sure.
it described how she was voting, and how she had voted.
Yep.
And I don't think she voted for the first time, but it was
incredible. Yeah.
It was an amazing story that kind of personalized, and he was
Yeah.
like, "That's who we do it
Wow,
for."
and
You get that. I mean, I think being at one of those speeches where you kind of know this is history, and the speaker nails it, that's got to be a thrill.
Why doesn't Barack use his gift of oratory post-presidential career more?
That's a good question. I think he does. I think
I
he's not.
can't-
It's not reported as much because he's not. I mean, I think he gives.
Where's he doing it?
He gives your speech. He does his charitable foundations and things. He's not intervening in politics, partly because I think he doesn't want to be what retired cops sometimes get called uncles. They always turn up at the cop shop. Hoping to get the gossip. I think he doesn't want to overshadow his successor. He likes Biden. I think you don't want to. Generally, ex-prime ministers and ex-presidents, I think good manners says you don't be a spare wheel. You don't want to start, being if Obama was making political speeches all the time, for a start, he'd get all the attention. There'd be a whole lot of, oh, why is he doing so much better than Biden? Why can't Biden do it this well? There'd be a whole. I think with very good reason he doesn't generally get involved in politics anymore. But
I mean, obviously, we're not inside the political apparatus, but what Biden lacks in most is charisma in public speaking.
Yeah.
Imagine if his old buddy Barack, who is exceptional at it, could do some of the heavy lifting here.
Well, no, he couldn't, precisely because you can only do your own heavy lifting. If Barack were doing the heavy lifting for Biden, what you'd see is a 10-stone weakling having his suitcase carried by, by the big muscly guy, which would make him look even weaker. I mean, Biden isn't a great orator. He's
He's shocking.
He's not good.
You end up kind of chuckling at him or feeling pity for him.
Yeah.
Every time.
No, I think he's not good. But there is no way, unfortunately, that Obama would do anything other than make his situation worse if he popped up and started being the prince across the water. And of course he can't. There's a term limit, and maybe what happens is Trump gets in again, abolishes all term limits, abolishes the rules. You can only be a 2-term president, attempts to install himself as dictator for life, and Barack is then able to come back and save us.
I want that timeline. That'd be something else.
All right, I'm not sure.
Sam, 2 more. I ask this to every single guest, and so it's completely non-rhetoric related.
Okay, great.
The first being, what is the role that serendipity has played in your life?
Serendipity. Well, I think with pure serendipity that I met my wife. So that obviously has been the decisive.
Pure serendipity?
Pure serendipity. Well, we happened to be at the same party together, and I nearly didn't go to the party, and she nearly didn't go to the party. And we were both really, really drunk, which was also serendipitous. So that certainly played. I mean, I think serendipity plays a part throughout my life. I mean, to be honest, my career was quite dramatically changed. I was a gossip columnist, and I ended up going to be a New York correspondent because of 9/11. And this book about rhetoric I wrote by chance because an article I'd written about Barack Obama, because serendipitously I got interested in rhetoric at university. Serendipitously I got interested in Obama at just the time when I was fired from a newspaper and had newly become freelance. So I was able to write a piece for the FT about Obama's rhetoric in 2008. By serendipity, that piece happened to fall into the hands of a book publisher who said, I think there's a book in this.
Okay.
So I was very lucky in that. No, I've been lucky all through my life. But yeah, serendipity has mostly been good for me, I think. so far.
I love it. And that is the most common response, particularly with a life partner. You
Yeah.
know, that is...
There's always chance that you meet. Almost
Yeah,
always chance. Yeah.
absolutely. Although less so now. Yeah, these... I imagine in 50 years, if I'm asking the same question to a bunch of people, it will be...
Oh, they'd all have met through an algorithm.
Well, it's an
wouldn't they?
algorithm.
Yeah.
Because it matches you, because you swipe right on some and left on others.
Yeah.
It's actually
No,
an
but
algorithm
it was
rather
literally like I'd been out the night before and I'd had an absolutely horrible night, and I so nearly didn't go to this birthday party, and she likewise, and so that was.
And here you are.
And here we are. Yeah,
3 kids.
exactly.
All right, mate. Last question.
Uh huh.
Again, super non-rhetoric related. But what is a country you're particularly bullish on?
Bullish. You mean what country do I think is about to
Bright future.
has a bright future? Oh boy, you do ask the difficult questions, don't you? I mean, you know, speaking as like somebody who is incredibly ignorant about global economics and politics, I mean, I would have to say I think it's China's looking pretty good.
Nice.
Everyone says that, don't they? I know I'm not very bullish on Russia. I'm less bullish on Ukraine than I was a year ago, as unfortunately all of us are. No, I think everywhere looks pretty terrible. I think of countries I know or like. I'm like, you know, it's okay. Lebanon, no. South Africa, no. Israel, triple no. You know, Russia, triple no. The UK, screwed. America's looking terrible. No, I think we're all doomed, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's uncanny, Sam, how...
Everyone says the same thing.
Everyone says the same thing. So I've done 4 interviews in 2
Yeah.
days.
Uh-huh.
Not one person could just pick out a country and say, you know what, I think they've got a good future. Whereas 2 years ago, everyone had a few countries top of mind. And so just as a, you know, non-data driven signal of what people's general sentiment is, it is not sunny, which is, you know, rather depressing.
Well, the trouble is, I mean, obviously because regional disturbances just translate, don't they? I mean, I'm sure there are a handful of African countries that are beginning to prosper because they're starting from a low bar, and you know, climate change hasn't really started to bite yet. But you know, I mean, okay, the Middle East is screwed. America's, you know, it looks like losing its republic, and everywhere else is, you know, dependent on America.
Yeah.
Eastern Europe's in all sorts of trouble. Europe, you know, America catches a cold, Europe sneezes. I mean, yeah. Maybe South America. Maybe it's fucking great in Uruguay.
Australia.
Well, Australia's kind of okay, isn't it?
We're kind of not immune, obviously,
You know what I mean?
but much further downstream from a lot of these problems.
Yeah, you've got a bit of the fash down there, but there's a bit of the fash all over everywhere, aren't there? And
A bit of the fascism.
yeah,
Okay.
but
Who's
yeah,
the
Australia
fascist?
seems like a nice place. I thought there was a bit of a hard right thing going on in the States. With a lot of kind of anti-immigration sentiment and the sort of
We've always
fish
had
and chip
that.
shop stuff, but
We've always had that.
unfortunately, actually, you know.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I'm not optimistic. But there again, I don't, you know, I'm not one of those people who.
All right,
Also, I
Sam,
spend a lot of time reading the news, so obviously because of all the cognitive biases.
You're not talking to the mic anymore.
Oh, sorry. Obviously, I spent a lot of time reading the news, so because of all the biases we know about in the news. No, Cat, don't knock that over. I will tend to have a less than rosy view of the world because, you know, if it bleeds, it leads.
Sam, loved the book. There's an updated version. There'll be a link to your podcast, the book as well. And I just can't thank you enough for being so
Well,
generous with your time and
Thank
inviting me to
you.
your home.
I'm very honoured to be on your podcast in such distinguished company. Thank you.
mate.